Welcome to the Daily Word, verse by verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we study the book of Galatians. Keep in mind, I am using the Holman Christian Standard Bible. So if you're using a different translation, the read is different, but the message is the same. Also keep in mind that these Daily Word, verse by verse studies are uploaded to my YouTube channel, BP The Bible Perspective. That's BP The Bible Perspective. So like and share these videos. And subscribe to BP The Bible Perspective. We are in Galatians chapter 6. Verse 16 again says, I say then walk in the Spirit and you will not carry out the desires of the flesh. We're diving into this because I think it's extremely important to understand where the problem is. Why is he saying this right here, right? Walk in the Spirit and you not carry out the desires of the flesh. So let's acknowledge something. There are desires of the flesh, and we're going to get to those later. What we have been explaining is, why is there a struggle in Christians' life? We are judged as Christians when we fall into sin. Christians probably are even more harsher to judge us when we fall into sin. And right here we have these desires and these struggles. So in explaining why we have them, we can then begin to understand how to overcome them. Because notice he says, if you walk in the Spirit, you will not carry out the desires of the flesh. So that's the solution, but let's understand the problem. So we said that man is a spirit, he has a soul, and he lives in a body. So again, we do my illustration again. This screen, if you're looking at the right side of your screen right here, that represents my spirit. Look at the left side of the screen. You see this side of the screen here, my flesh, my 5 physical senses, my sight, hearing, taste, smell, touch. With that, I contact the physical world around me. This side with my spirit, I contact the spiritual world around me. Now, until we were born again, this side is dark. We lived in darkness. Because we lived in this darkness, there was no light of God, right? There was no light of God, no life of God. So therefore, if we had lived in this light, we could have something to battle and struggle against the flesh, right? Well, until then, we live in darkness. So then we were a slave to the 5 physical senses. Why? Because not only did what we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we feel, stimulates our bodies, but it also forms and fashions our thoughts. It forms and fashions our desires, our will. And that's an important thing. It drags our will. So there's this struggle for the control. The control center of man is his soul, his thoughts, his intellect, right? His mind, his desires, his will, right? What he desires, right? His emotions. Those are fed by both sides. Now what happens? So now the unsaved man, the unchristian man, he doesn't have this side, the light influence in him. So really there's no struggle. He may live by his intellect. He may live by, developed intellect, right? But he's still a slave to his sin because what he knows about the world and his universe comes through the 5 physical senses. Not to get too philosophical, one of the reasons that's why an atheist can say, hey, I don't see God. I don't feel him, right? I don't process him through my 5 physical senses, so let me deny him. Now, the other thing is we need to understand that, notice, and I'm going to, again, I went to Romans chapter 7, and the one thing that he says here, verse 14 again, for we know that the law is spiritual, but I am flesh, sold into sin's power. And then in verse 18 he says, for I know that nothing good lives in me, that is, in my flesh. So why is that? Because your flesh, apart from God, is now contaminated with sin. So its desires, it wants to be gratified. That's the whole thing about your flesh. So what you see, what you hear, what you taste, what you feel, it stimulates gratification. Your flesh wants gratification. So now you come to Christ. Now what happens? You come to Christ. And when you come to Christ, all of a sudden now, you're full of light. Light is coming in. You are aware of God. You are aware of God's presence in your life. And so thus, this light now becomes a struggle between, we can say good or evil, but it also is a struggle for the soul, your thoughts, your emotions, your desires, and most importantly, your will. Now, it's important to understand that in why you feel the way you feel. Your flesh hasn't changed. It will not change until this flesh is redeemed or glorified or resurrected. That is the left promise, the promise we have by Christ, that one day we're going to be, this body is going to be resurrected, full of life, changed. Okay, and from that point we no longer will be slaves to sin. We won't have a sin nature. We won't have carnal desires. But until then, we have to put our flesh in check. We have to put our flesh, we have to control it. So how do we control it? Well, notice he says in verse 16, walk by the Spirit, and do not carry out the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is against the Spirit, and the Spirit desires what is against the flesh. And these are opposed to each other, so that you don't do what you want. But then he said, but if you're led by the Spirit, you're not under the law. Now that's the context, of course, to what he's talking about. This is what the law couldn't do. The law could not enable you to walk by the Spirit. Let's expand this. The law cannot enable you to live out what you may, even your standard of holiness. You fail. Your standard of right and wrong, your standard of good, you fail at your own standard. You sin against your own standard. So he says, but if you walk by the Spirit, and the idea here is that you cannot do that by saying, let me obey the law of God, let me do good works, let me be religious. Let me be religious. So you can't do that. So he says, if you walk in the Spirit, you'll not carry out the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires against the Spirit, and the Spirit desires what is against the flesh. These are opposed to the other, so you cannot do what you want. But if you're led by the Spirit, now again, I'll come back to that point. If you're led by the Spirit, then you are not under the law. Now let me also say this. My flesh, and I'm gonna get more into this in the next video. Understand why your flesh is evil. Because through the 5 physical senses, you contact the evil world around you. In fact, let me look at 1 John chapter 5. And verse 19 says, we know that we are of God, and the whole world is under the sway of the evil one. And what does that mean? The whole world is under the sway of the evil one, which means what? All that you receive from the world through your 5 physical senses is what? Evil. Understand that. So that And I'm not talking about, of course, if you look at a tree, look at the beauty of a tree, that's evil. Okay, that's what they known as there was a form of Gnosticism called that sprouted up during the time of the Apostle John. You know, that's not what we're talking about. I'm talking about how that through your flesh it only desires what is evil. That you have to control it. Now I'll pick this up in the next video, so I'll see you then.